Welcome to the 2023 Reuters Memorial Lecture, organized by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism here at the university. Our mission is to explore the future of journalism worldwide, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here tonight to be part of that, those of you who are here in the room with us, and those of you who are joining us online. Welcome. My name is Rasmus Nelson. I'm director of the Institute. We work with journalists and editors from all over the world at the Institute. We have amazing fellows here. We work with journalists and reporters in many different other ways as well. And I think all of you recognize that many of them face great challenges in their professional lives. How do you practice journalism in a desperately poor and deeply unequal society? How do you practice journalism under a right-wing military dictatorship? How do you practice journalism under a left-wing revolutionary government? How might you practice journalism during a civil war fueled by a foreign power? How might you practice journalism under what claims to be a nominally left-wing dictatorship? How might you practice journalism if you're forced into exile by a regime that does not appreciate the attempt to seek truth and report it? Or hold power to account. Tonight's speaker has faced all of these challenges in the course of his life and his professional career. Carlos Fernando Chamorro is the founder and editor of the news site Confidencial in Nicaragua. He is the host of several TV shows, important shows in the country and watched abroad as well, and formerly of the newspapers La Prensa and Barricada. He has faced more challenges in his professional life than I hope any of you ever will. And tonight he is here with us to speak about how to report under dictatorship, lessons from Nicaragua and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Carlos Fernando to the stage.
Buenas noches. Good night for everyone. Thank you very much, Rasmus, Alan, and to the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism for honoring me with this invitation to speak today on behalf of my fellow Nicaraguan journalists and hopefully also from colleagues of other countries of the region to share our experiences about reporting under dictatorship. On February 15 this year, 94 Nicaraguan citizens were stripped of our nationality by the regime of Daniel Ortega and his wife, Rosario Murillo. It was an illegal and unconstitutional act in violation of international treaties signed by Nicaragua. The penalty also included the loss of our political rights in perpetuity and the confiscation of our properties and assets, including our Social Security retirement pensions. The list of 94 includes 11 journalists, directors such as myself of exile media outlets like Confidencial, 100% Noticias, Artículo 66, Nicaragua Investiga, Radio Darío, Divergentes, Café con Voz, and others. 6 days earlier, on February 9, another 222 people, all political prisoners, were released from prison, deported to the United States, and also stripped of their Nicaraguan nationality. With this act of revenge, Daniel Ortega erased with one hand the gesture he did with the other. The only political prisoners who refused to accept the forced exile was Catholic Church Bishop Rolando Alvarez, who was sentenced a day later in a speedy trial to 26 years in prison. He has been transferred to a maximum security cell. Among those released from prison were 12 people linked to the media, a sports reporter and blogger, 3 executives of the daily newspaper La Prensa, a journalist who founded the cable television channel 100% Noticias, a political television commentator, several local journalists, and even a driver from La Prensa whose crime was having transported the reporters who covered the news of the expulsion from Nicaragua of the nuns of Mother Teresa of Calcutta's order on July 6, 2022. All of them have been convicted without any evidence for alleged crimes of conspiracy against the national sovereignty, money laundering, and spreading fake news, and were held in isolation in prison or under house arrest for up to 600 days. Among the 327 people stripped of our nationality, there are also political and civic leaders, economists, political analysts, attorneys, business people, diplomats, academics, scientists, doctors, priests, and social activists. Many of them have been essential sources of information for the independent press in a country where for more than 15 years, access to public record has been prohibited. As a result of this persecution, there are no longer any independent sources in Nicaragua to whom facts, data, or analysis can be attributed. Because of fears of official reprisals, including imprisonment, all of them without exception request anonymity as a condition to inform or give the opinion to the press. This double-sided criminalization of both freedom of the press and also freedom of expression with the purpose of silencing journalists, news sources, and freedom of opinion represents the latest stage in a long process of demolishing the rule of law in Nicaragua. Under the de facto police state, there is no freedom of assembly or association in Nicaragua. The regime persecutes the Catholic Church and even prohibits religious procession. In 2021, it got rid of all political competition and erased the possibility of holding free elections. And since 2022, it has increased its relentless persecution against civil society, shutting down more than 3,200 non-governmental organizations. In this context, journalism done from exile remains as the last reserve of all our constitutional freedoms. Let me briefly explain where we have come from and how we got to this point. I began my journalism career under the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza 45 years ago in February 1978, 1 month after the assassination of my father, journalist Pedro Joaquín Chamorro, director of the newspaper La Prensa. At that time, 20 years before the invention of the internet, journalists defied censorship of radio newscasts, reading the news in the atriums of churches in what was baptized as catacomb journalism. And in the final days of the insurrection against the dictatorship, Somoza ordered the destruction of the newspaper La Prensa, launching a tank attack against its installations as if it was a military target. During the Sandinista revolution, facing a war of foreign aggression and a civil war in the 80s, the militarization of politics replaced journalism by war propaganda and counter-propaganda, imposing state censorship and self-censorship as norms. In 1990, a democratic transition began in which the media flourished in a true springtime for freedom of expression. Under the government of my mother, Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, freedom of the press and tolerance towards freedom of expression became a government policy, along with the professionalization of the army and the police. Mistakenly, we thought that democracy and the achievements of the transition were irreversible. But since Daniel Ortega's electoral return to power in 2007, democratic institutions have been demolished in more than 16 years of authoritarian regression. Combining electoral fraud and the illegal re-election of the president, Ortega was able to consummate the co-optation of all branches of government. Ortega's wife, Rosario Murillo, who is the official spokesperson of the government, designed a communication strategy to impose the so-called uncontaminated information, that is, information in what she called a pure state that will reach the citizens directly through the official media without passing through the filters of questions or investigation by an independent press. A decade before the emergence of Donald Trump in the United States and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Daniel Ortega had already labeled the independent press as the enemy. And long before the era of fake news, he accused journalists of being the children of Goebbels, unleashing violent lynching campaigns in the official media in response to allegations of corruption and abuses of power by his government. In the early years, Ortega promoted intimidation against the independent press, as well as political espionage and the blocking of access to public records. He also created his own private media empire. However, during the time he was able to govern based on an economic alliance with big business without democracy or transparency, he tolerated the existence of media such as Confidencial that investigated the corruption of the regime, such as the diversion of more than $5 billion of Venezuelan state aid to his private business, or the mega swindle scandal of the failed Interoceanic Canal project. Probably because he had total control over all branches of government, including the army and the police, he did not consider the media, he did not consider the weak political opposition to be either competition or a threat to his control. When this model of authoritarian government collapsed under the explosion of civic protest in April 2018, the regime saw its power threatened, and it responded with brutal repression that left more than 300 murders in impunity, and the press was also deemed an enemy to be crushed. Repression against journalism included assassinations and physical assaults against journalists, television censorship, physical destruction of media outlets, and customs blockades to prevent newspapers from getting paper and other material. All this culminated in the closure and confiscation of media outlets, the imposition of new repressive laws, and the imprisonment of journalists. In the almost 5 years of socio-political crisis between 2018 and 2023, between de facto and judicial attacks, Nicaragua has concentrated all the crimes against the press that took more than a decade to carry out in Venezuela. In 2020, the special law on cyber crimes was approved. This punishes with prison sentences of 1 to 5 years the alleged crime of spreading so-called fake news through social media and media outlets, which according to the law causes anxiety, destabilization, and moral damage. But the law does not define what fake news is. Under this law, more than 20 people have been sentenced to prison terms for the alleged crimes of fake news, including journalists, activists, priests, and even a peasant who did not have any social media account. Doing journalism under a dictatorship to continue reporting and telling the truth is an act of resistance. My own newsroom at Confidencial has been confiscated twice. First, our offices were raided by the police without any warrant at midnight on December 13, 2018, and then continued to be permanently occupied by armed guards. In November 2019, we set up a new temporary newsroom, but on May 20, 2021, we were again raided by the police, who once again stole all our computers and TV equipment. Despite all that, we never stopped reporting and broadcasting, not even a single day, by using digital platforms. Ortega also confiscated the offices of the cable TV channel 100% Noticias and the newspaper La Prensa, but he has never been able to confiscate journalism itself, and the confiscated media continue to report from exile. The regime has also shut down more than 40 local radio and television stations, and more than 150 journalists have been forced into exile. Some of them have reorganized around some 25 digital media outlets, mainly in Costa Rica, Spain, and the United States. However, more than a third of exiled journalists have had to take on other jobs to survive, or have left the profession for fear of reprisals against their families in Nicaragua. Our television programs esta semana and esta noche have been banned from broadcast and cable television, but we continue to reach an audience of more than 415,000 subscribers through Confidencial YouTube channel and Facebook. Social media represent an extraordinary vehicle for overcoming censorship, but they have also become a space for disinformation and political polarization that competes against the independent press. Without democracy and the rule of law, the existence of a free press is threatened by the arbitrariness of power without limits, as is the case today in Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, where there is no protection for journalists. Human rights organizations and organizations that work for freedom of the press in the Americas and Europe have made an extraordinary effort to document and make visible the persecution of the press in these three countries. But ultimately, our only protection lies in doing more and better journalism to strengthen the credibility of the media and our relationship with our audiences. Only quality journalism can determine the effectiveness of the press against the machinery of disinformation and propaganda of the 5 television stations, dozens of radio stations, and internet portals, which are managed by the ruling family as private business paid by the state in Nicaragua. Since mid-2021, I am in exile for the second time in Costa Rica to avoid being silenced because of a criminal indictment and arrest warrant for me in Nicaragua. My entire newsroom and practically all independent media are working from exile. Exile is no longer a temporary emergency situation that forces us to leave and relocate to another country. It is now a permanent, medium-term condition that poses immense challenges for journalism. Our purpose continues to be to tell the story of how to change a dictatorship through civic resistance, but this news is not to be reported in the bubble of exile in Costa Rica or the United States, but in Nicaragua. Reporting on Nicaragua from outside the country requires cultivating sources that are actively at risk under the police state. At the same time, it means raising the standards of verification and corroborating anonymous sources in order to continue publishing reliable information. Second, we must develop our sources' trust in order to investigate corruption, government employees' discontent, and the crisis of the regime from within. We also have to guarantee secure channels of communication to protect our sources. Third, we have to expand our capacity for observation and reporting through a network of collaborators. And we professionally curate the torrent of images and information on social media to be able to see, to hear, and report on the mood of daily life, the social crisis, repression, resistance, and a hope for change. Fourth, we face the challenge of continuing to innovate in digital platforms in order to strengthen our relationship with our audiences and to tell memorable stories that allow us to counteract the official lies and viral misinformation on social media. Fact-checking initiatives are necessary, but not sufficient means to overcome misinformation. In addition, it's necessary to recover the credibility and trust in a useful press, capable of reconnecting with its audiences, and even of taking advantage of the reach of social media to promote quality journalism. Fifth, journalism in exile also is involved in international and Latin American collaborative journalism initiatives, such as the Latin American Center for Investigative Journalism, CLIP, or the Journalistic Platform for the Americas, Conectas, to produce regional stories that unfold in several countries that we tell through innovative multimedia narrative formats. And last but not least, we face the challenge of financial sustainability of journalism in exile. In addition to the crisis caused by the digital revolution and unfair competition with the technological giants, we face the criminalization of our traditional advertisers. The crisis forces us to look for new models of economic management to finance the independence of our media through international donations, audience contributions, and commercial monetization. But this also demands a paradigm shift for philanthropic foundations and international aid agencies that support independent journalism. It becomes necessary to recognize that the survival of the press in exile, not only in Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, but also in Russia, Ukraine, Iran, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Azerbaijan, and other countries, is a democratic imperative that requires long-term support strategies. I have selected a sample of 10 stories published in Confidencial between 2018 and 2023, some of them international award winners that best illustrate how we are reporting under a dictatorship. The investigation, They Shot to Kill with Precision, was published in Confidencial in June 2018, based on 19 CT scans of victims killed and wounded during the repression. It revealed the existence of a lethal pattern of shots to the head and thorax of civilians carried out by snipers with weapons of war. The evidence, corroborated by medical specialists and by the testimonies of the victims' family members, became one of the pillars supporting the subsequent report of the International Human Rights Commissions on the massacre and the so-called cleanup operation in Nicaragua. The in-depth interview with economist Ligia Gomez, former FSLN political secretary at the Central Bank of Nicaragua, was published in November 2018. It was about the moment when Rosario Murillo issued the order Vamos con todo to unleash the massacre, and was the first in a series of investigation into how the chain of command of repression functions as a coordinated operation between the police and paramilitary groups. The series of investigation published in February 2020 on extrajudicial executions in the countryside and the massacre of peasants revealed a hidden reality in rural areas, with more than 30 murders that occurred between 2018 and 2019, and the co-responsibility of the Nicaraguan army. Investigations on governmental concealment of the tragedy of the massive numbers of deaths caused by COVID-19, published in 2021 and 2022, showed that Nicaragua was one of the countries with the highest rate in the world of excess mortality due to COVID-19, based on a comparative analysis during the first 21st month of the pandemic of the official death certificates for pneumonia, heart attack, diabetes, and hypertension. This was a data journalism story with a human face, thanks to the testimonies of the victims' family members and of the doctors and health workers who defied official censorship, many of whom paid the cost of dismissal and repressions. Reports on the conditions of hundreds of political prisoners subjected to prolonged torture and isolation, as well as investigation on the impunity of the machinery of repression, the police, the prosecutor's office, and the judiciary, have dominated the news between 2018 and 2023, all the while the regime failed in its efforts to erase the political prisoners from the national memory. The investigation into the Ortega Murillo family network of 22 private companies, published in February 2022 and based on official board minutes, revealed the existence of a network of frontmen and a system of corruption in their private business that are financed by public funds and the diversion of Venezuelan government aid. The identity-protected testimony of senior government officials and dozens of public servants on corruption and repression, published in 2022, revealed the increasing erosion of political support for the regime, which has turned government workers into hostages. Between 2018 and 2023, there has been a massive exodus of more than 600,000 Nicaraguans, mainly to the United States and Costa Rica, equivalent to 10% of our population. Confidencial's Nicas Migrantes platform has told the story of the other Nicaragua, migrants stranded in Ciudad Juárez, Mexico, those who have drowned trying to cross the Rio Bravo or perish suffocated in a van in Mexico, abandoned by coyotes, or migrant workers who are victims of labor exploitation in Costa Rica. The investigations on the Ortega regime's main international allies, Russia, Cuba, Venezuela, China, and Iran, have revealed clientelistic relationships with governments that promote political espionage and impunity, and that have had little or no positive impact in terms of investment, international trade, or foreign aid that is still being received by Nicaragua. The cartoons by P.X. Molina and the political satire of the television segments La Última Mirada News and Fuera de Broma have demonstrated that humor and mockery represents the most effective resource in the face of authoritarian power as a way to dismantle the Orwellian language of official lies. None of these journalistic investigations produce any change in the public policies of Daniel Ortega's authoritarian regime, which is not designed to be held accountable. However, many of these stories, data, are valuable inputs for the report on human rights violations in Nicaragua presented today in Geneva by the group of experts at the United Nations Human Rights Council meeting. The report concludes that there is clear evidence of the responsibility of President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo and the chain of command of the state in the commissions of crimes against humanity that continue to this day in Nicaragua. In the evidence of this transcendental report is the imprint of Nicaraguan journalism in exile. Together with the families of the victims of repression, journalism has documented the first draft of truth and memory to lay the foundations of justice as one of the pillars for the restitution of democracy in Nicaragua. Meanwhile, the state maintains the hate speech it uses to stigmatize citizens as coup perpetrators, terrorists, and now stateless. But despite the fear and silence and the attempt to normalize a dictatorship in impunity, the independent press is winning the battle for the truth. The main challenge for the press in the face of the deterioration of democracy will always be to monitor power and do good journalism, even in the midst of the worst condition of political polarization. The collapse of the rule of law in Nicaragua and the consolidation of the dictatorship is a mirror in which the Central American press, threatened by authoritarian tendencies, is being seen today. In Guatemala, the Yang Matei government has kept José Rubén Zamora, editor of El Periódico, in jail for 7 months and is threatening other journalists. In El Salvador, the Nayib Bukele regime has already tagged the independent press as the enemy. In Honduras, we celebrate today the Gabriel Garcia Marquez Award that was conferred by the Gabo Foundation to young journalist Jennifer Avila, directora of Contracorriente, as an example of courage and practicing good journalism in the context of violence, corruption, and organized crime. Central American journalists are united by our commitment not to give in to intimidation and censorship, not to fall into self-censorship. As proclaimed by the new Central American network of journalists created last year in Guatemala, silence is not an option. And in the face of the temptation that journalists sometimes suffer to supplant the role of political parties and other institutions in crisis, we have to remember every day that journalists are not judges, detectives, police, or auditors. Our mission is also not to stray into activism, but to preserve our autonomy to monitor public and private powers and the new forces that advocate change. Nicaragua's experience shows that the resistance of the press in exile under a dictatorship is not enough to clear the way for democratic change. But as long as it continues to do more and better journalism, it will keep the flame of freedom of the press burning as the last reservoir of all freedoms. Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you, Carlos, for that lecture. I could hear complete silence in the room because I think many of us felt it was not an easy thing to listen to. It was extremely humbling, I think, to be reminded of the resilience and of what journalism should be and what it can be at its best. I thought it was inspiring in the way that you described the bravery of your colleagues and the determination to carry on. And I thought it was also a warning because you were describing something that can so easily happen and the domino effect and the way that autocrats learn from each other and how the situation can so easily develop from something that is awful to something that is terrible. So we're going to have a discussion here with three distinguished journalists, all of them members of the, two members of the advisory panel. At the end we've got John-Allan Namu, who is co-founder of Africa Uncensored and has had a 20-year career doing some of Kenya's most daring investigations. And in the middle, welcome to Luz Mely Reyes, who's a Venezuelan multimedia journalist who is winner of multiple awards. Now, each country is different. We've had an extreme account of what life is like in Nicaragua today. I wonder, Luis, could you begin by describing the situation in Venezuela and how does that compare?
Hello, good evening. Hola a los venezolanos que están acá. Hello, Venezuelans who are here. I think that Carlos brought this situation, similar situation in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. We always say that this kind of system, they learn each other how to do the things to persecute the press freedom. I come from a country, and I always try to explain that we lost our democracy in less than 24 years, something that it was impossible to think 25 years ago. People believed that we were a democracy. We criticize our democracy, of course, but we didn't believe that we are going to lose in less than 2 decades. So Carlos said that they believe in Nicaragua that the rise and the democracy could be, like a progressive right, and now they are looking, they are living these experiences. So in my country, we have this kind of civic environment, restricted space. And some of the government offers that if we complain so much and we continuing doing our job, people from civic society, they can turn to a new Nicaragua. So Nicaragua is an example for them. But I always like to say that even we are living this dramatic situation with a lot of things, I think that we have a lot of energy and a lot of people who is doing something different in Venezuela, who believe in the rise and the democracy and the values of democracy. And something that we share also with Carlos is the only way that we can do defending journalism is doing much and better journalism, no matter the situation. And I think we can find examples also in Venezuela, like in Nicaragua, and El Salvador, in Cuba, a group of journalists, the journalists that they're doing a good journalism. So I think that it's a dramatic situation, but we are still doing what we had to do. Thank you.
John-Allan, I mean, Kenya is very different. What did you recognize from what Carlos was saying, and what are the differences that you'd like to tease out?
I think the thing that I recognized, and the analogy that you used is really powerful, that there was a time that there was a springtime for press freedom and media freedom, broadly speaking. That was, I want to say, maybe about 20 years ago in Kenya. There was this sort of regeneration of what press freedom meant. I think we're at the turning point that could go either very badly for our country, or, depending on how we respond as citizens, very well. And by extension, I think this is something that's happening in different African countries, where the lack of responsiveness to the actual challenges that people are facing is seeing young people specifically, because we're one of the youngest populations in the world, Africa, withdraw from the democratic process, be ambivalent or just generally distrustful of democracy. And the space that they're withdrawing from is now being occupied by people who use the language of reform, use the language of progress, but absolutely do not mean anything that they're saying, and in fact have become, both oligarchs and tenderpreneurs that are leeching off of the state. What this means for press freedom is that because of some of the, the global pressures that the media is facing in terms of business models, and this kind of complacency that we've reached the promised land, in a sense, that we can rest on our laurels. There's a downturn in terms of professionalism within the media that is hurting the media itself, but also a very targeted, very clever, I have to say, response to these gaps by the state, withdrawal of advertising, creation of their own, as you had mentioned, media houses or media houses that are adjacent to their own point of view, and enforcing that on the public. And the allowing of this flourishing of an environment of fake news, news that you cannot trust, and creation of this environment where you don't know what the truth is. And then that sort of like the veil that covers a lot of the other sins that are taking place. Whistleblowers from within government in different areas are under constant threat. We're currently doing a story about a whistleblower who has spent almost 2 years of his life outside of the country for a relatively small crime. But because it touches on such senior people in government, then he's unable to come home. And his is not the first example. So I think we are, to borrow your analogy, and you know, Western seasons, in the autumn of our understanding of what media freedom is, it could very quickly turn into a very cold and long winter. And that's my fear.
Carlos, in your lecture, just to pick up on one practicality, you mentioned that how important it is to protect sources. It's a question I'd like to ask each of you, is whether in 2023 it is actually possible ever to keep sources, to assure sources that they can be protected. Because each state now has very high capabilities of penetrating almost any form of communication. So how difficult is it for you actually to protect sources? And when you try and make guarantees of safety, can you actually carry through on the promise?
It is very difficult. It is very difficult. We've been successful in some cases. I just talked to people who had been in prison that, well, there was one prisoner who was a former government employee. He was accused of being the source that was leaking information to me, and that wasn't true. And anyways, he was condemned. There was another source that I had that had been sharing information with us, and he was never asked about that. But I can mention those two examples, but in general, it's very complicated. We don't know about the state capabilities of spying, using some resources from Russia, and well, Pegasus and different other things in terms of intervening cell phones, etc. But people are completely afraid to talk to us. That's the first point, the first obstacle that we have to overcome is how do you develop trust that he will not be heard by anyone. Sometimes we have changed people, not only change identity in terms of blocking their images, but also changing their voice. A man becomes a woman or vice versa. And that is something that gives people some kind of trust that his, let's say, testimony, his declaration cannot be reversed, because we don't do that through software or anything like that. We do it manually. So you have to really work hard on that. But again, every time it is more difficult to convince people, because it's not a question of them being paranoid. It's that there are so many evidences and facts that the police have come to a house looking for one individual. They did not find him, and they took his wife and his daughter and his son-in-law to prison, the three of them, a whole family, like the Nazis, you know, this kind of thing. So people say they put in the balance the risk that they're taking by talking to the independent press.
I can see you nodding, Luz. Is it the case that do you trust any technology to be able to talk securely to your sources?
Well, we have this kind of ordeal with people. People or sources have to trust in you first, and you have to show with your behavior that they can trust you. I think it's the most important thing. The other thing that is an opportunity to learn more about digital security, because as we know that this kind of software, the Pegasus, but some of the rules of digital security, it depends of our way that we work day to day. And for example, we used to talk with some people about use Signal or this kind of or app in order to exchange information. In other case, we have to create other things to share the information. But I have to say that we have a very strong group of people who is looking for information, and they, even the threats, even the risk, they give the face. And they support with declaration and this kind of thing, the information that they gave us. But I have also to say that people can be afraid, to show in a public way, because the government can take any measure against them.
John-Allan, I can also see you nodding. I mean, in many Western governments at the moment, encryption is spoken of as a bad thing. But encryption is at the heart of secure communications for people who want to be whistleblowers or want to be dissidents. How do you deal with that problem?
Well, I mean, there's a number of protocols that we have as an organization, and broadly speaking, for many organizations in Kenya and beyond that are worth their salt, there will be ways in which you communicate, either through, at a minimum, secure chat platforms like Signal, as an example. But the Harrods investigation very recently showed us that even there might be people who are able to infiltrate these kinds of platforms. We all thought Telegram was a safe channel, safer at least than others. Turns out that it wasn't. And ultimately, no one source, wherever you are in the world, is 100% safe, and it's a kind of barriers that you're able to place between bad actors and the information that the source has. For us, though, in Kenya, and I dare say in East Africa and the region, it's a deeper question. And the question isn't so much about whether I can protect the source, but the question is, what happens once the information that the source gives becomes public? Is there going to be action? And the answer to that, unfortunately, is many times there isn't. Many times, governments pretend that they're ducks and have that, water roll off their backs, or wait until the news cycle moves on. And then the source is more or less left twisting in the wind. In as much as you might want to try and protect, and you dedicate as much of your own personal or company resources to protect this source, the source still feels exposed because there's no action, there's no change, the situation is the same or becomes worse for them as individuals, and that the situation doesn't change in a medium term. The existence of that status quo is, I think, the bigger threat to sources than even the capacity of the journalist to protect them. Because what it does is that it has a chilling effect on every other source. This happened to this particular source. I'll give a quick example. There was an accountant in a university that exposed massive fraud of the vice chancellor, was exposed to very serious threats. It became a huge news splash. The journalists who did it did an excellent job. 2 years, 3 years later, this man is struggling for work. The vice chancellor that he exposed has been reinstated in her place of work. And the wheels keep, turning in terms of that particular institution being a possible conduit for corruption. What do you tell the next source who has access to this kind of information? That there'll be change, or even if I protect you, there will also be change. That's the tension that we face. And so I guess in a sense, it's the same in terms of the kinds of things that we need to do, but it's also different in terms of the outcomes of the information that they volunteer.
I should have said at the beginning, but in a few minutes, I'm going to turn to you for any questions that you have. So if you can be formulating crisp questions, and we've got microphones that will come to you. But until we do that, I was very interested, Carlos, in your touching on social media. Again, in many Western countries, social media has now got such a bad reputation, and there is a ton of regulation coming down to make social media companies behave more responsibly, and to stop spreading disinformation. I mean, I guess it's a much more mixed position from your point of view, because you're talking about a world of information chaos where nobody knows what's true. But nevertheless, social media is a lifeline. And you must be all three of you must be very suspicious about who actually gets to arbitrate on what is fake and what is true. Can you talk a bit about the positive aspects of social media?
Well, the positive aspect is the capacity to distribute content in a situation of censorship. I made the example about before the invention of internet. Well, there was censorship and there was no way to distribute content except reading the news in the churches. Well, now the government imposed censorship, and we didn't know what YouTube was useful for. Now I understand YouTube is my main channel of distribution of audiovisual content. Well, Facebook Live and others too. And then there was another dimension, and that is the moment in which people became empowered in this explosion of revolt against the Ortega regime. They went out to the street with their cell phones, and they did incredible things that obviously forced us to impose some basic processes of verification, of ethics, about how to use that information. The interesting thing is that for one period, they were distributing facts. Now, when social media became toxic, they became making just opinions and no more facts anymore. In the balance, I think it's still a key positive thing to overcome censorship. And I understand it is an element of competition to the credibility of the press, because now, well, one of these investigations that I mentioned, we spent several months reporting, doing the work of verification of information. We publish it, and then several days later, I start receiving comments from people from Miami, from different cities, saying, well, I don't know if this is true or not, but this is something that I read in WhatsApp. And that was my report, my investigation. And those people, they don't care about where did they get it from. For them, there is no relationship between information and credible media. So I said, wow, this is a threat for us, because these people they're not reading the media. They believe what their uncle said about WhatsApp or Facebook, and I think that's a problem. Now, can we use social media for our benefit in terms of promoting also quality journalism? I think that is a challenge, and we're trying also to do that. So yes, my answer is I have more a mixed balance, and I still see, let's say, I still try to see the positive angle of that.
How do you think the average Venezuelan negotiates this problem of knowing what's true and what's not true? They're being besieged with stuff, and how do they use their critical faculties to work out what to believe?
Que como un venezolano a veraje decide qué es verdad o no es verdad de lo que ven en los medios de social media.
Thank you. Well, I have to tell something. We have this kind of mix of feeling because 9 years ago, when the censorship began to be strong, people moved to social media, people moved to Twitter, and then in that moment, a group of journalists, we decide to create Efecto Cocuyo, which is the platform which I work for. And because we say people is looking for information. And it was a lot of disinformation, but people was looking for that. It's very difficult, of course, because now this information is a machine. So, but we promise to the people that they are going to find the reports that we are doing, they are verified, and they are going to find the facts in our reports. So I think there is a way that to create this community, the people that, that they say, okay, I'm going to read this media, or I'm going to look for this journalist, or I'm going to look for this place because I know they are deliver good information. It's not easy, but it demands, of course, from people that be more active in a way that they consume information. And I think there is a space of opportunity in order to create, educate, train people, how they cannot avoiding disinformation, avoiding spread disinformation, and look for good sources of information.
Same question for you. I mean, you seem to imply in what you said earlier that people are just switching off. They don't know who to believe, and their reaction is to reject it all.
Well, I think I was being a little facetious in that answer because it's not a complete answer. I think there's also this side of the public that has become more aware of what looks like fake news and better able to respond to it. But that's usually the public that's more engaged with the matters of the day. The 2022 election in Kenya was a good example of that, where the public were not only more aware of what was happening in terms of the realm of fake news, but they were actually fact-checking the press and the government. And I think that's a very positive thing. My take on social media is that, my organization wouldn't have been able to exist without social media. And so in a sense, I owe many of the things that we've been able to do to the existence of these platforms. But I think these platforms ought to take a lot more responsibility in how they create the playing field for information that's quality to be able to rise a little further to the top. It's almost like children and eating vegetables. You know that it's good for you, but children will always go and eat sugar because that's tastier. And that's what the information environment is like. Emotional information is always going to be a lot more attractive than the information that has been sifted for actual quality. And that's the tension, that's the debate that I think all of us are facing. How do you make the information that you've worked on more interesting, more appealing, and generally just have a more astute public that knows to be able to pick the right kind of information and make it part of their news diet more regularly? That's difficult. But then at the same time, there's pockets of hope, where you see the public actively, doing things that even media houses haven't, weren't for one reason or another able to do. That for me is where I think the best hope lies. In a sense, it's part of the problem, but it's also part of the solution.
Final question for you, John-Allan, before we go to the audience. It was about Carlos's point about humor and mockery. I remember when I was in Kenya, we met in around about 2016. The great Kenyan cartoonist Gado really got under the skin of the government to the extent that he was sacked by his newspaper. That was the sort of price they had to pay if they wanted to continue having advertising. So that suggested to me that humor and mockery does work.
Oh, it does. And it's been a staple of Kenyan public social commentary for as long as I've been aware of it, from the Moi dictatorship onwards to the Kibaki regime, the former regime of Uhuru Kenyatta, and even today. And I think the public is now an owner of that space in a sense where they use, memes have become a staple of Kenyans' WhatsApp diets. If you want to know that something's really got to the heart of that's really gotten under the skin of the government, you just look at your WhatsApp feed or your Twitter feed, and there'll be a stream of memes that are mocking the state of affairs. And that's really a very good, thermometer to tell you that this is an issue that you need to pay attention to.
Right, let's have some hands, and there's a hand here. If we could get the microphones, one hand here and down at the front here. One to Helen and one to Noah here. Are you wanting a question as well? Okay, you keep a mic. Let's hear from Helen first.
Okay, my name is Helen. I'm on the advisory board. Carlos, that was an amazingly sobering and illuminating speech, and the panel has been fantastic. And I'm going to ask what could be seen as a very girly question here, but I'm deeply interested in what's giving you your resilience in the environment that you are in, both intellectual and emotional. You, Carlos, described losing your dad. You've now lost your country, your economic status, etc., and you did it in such a measured way. I wonder what keeps you going, not in a facile way, but in the sense of true resilience, because you are dealing with both people who give you information and other journalists who need at least a quota of that to keep them going. And I think anybody from the UK environment is just humbled by what you've said this evening. I found it really inspiring, and I feel very grateful you've been so honest with us. So tell us, what is the secret to your resilience?
How do you do it?
Well, we don't pretend to be heroes, or we don't pretend to... We are afraid. I guess what keeps us going is that there is a sense of commitment with people that have trust us, and that people who have suffered much more than us, and that they have a hope for justice. And there will not be justice unless there is a minimum basis of truth. And that, I believe, is one of our main roles. We have got confused, and I myself have made errors in my own life in the sense of what is our role as journalists. I mean, we're not supposed to be leading or provoking political changes or anything like that. Probably I thought about that many years ago. And I think now we just want to be more modest in the kind of things that we can do. But there has been so much, I guess, suffering in Nicaragua, but also a lot of hope. And what keeps me going, I think, is trying to give this hope some kind of rational or basis support with evidence, and with allowing people not to accept silence. Silence is the worst thing that we could accept. And this is, I think, the major challenge. Now the church in Nicaragua is under silence because the major bishop is in prison, and but not only the church, the business class is in silence, and many other sectors. And so we say, okay, so we can do that, and we're taking risks. But there are other people that have taken much more risks.
Question here.
I'm Manar Ismail. I'm a fellow journalist with Reuters Institute. Thank you, firstly. And then my question is, you said you have a lot of obstacles that faces you. So my question is, what's the best ways to report under this kind of circumstances without facing a lot of risks?
¿Qué es lo que puedes hacer? La mejor forma de hacer cobertura es bajo estos riesgos que hay.
Well, we've been through different moments in terms of risks. There was a time in which reporters were facing risk of physical aggression. Now, as I said, most of us are in exile, and basically we are protecting sources and trying to keep our information right and our credibility. But I don't think there is some kind of a una receta, or different things require different strategies in terms of how to deal with this kind of situation. But again, we spend a lot of time trying to discuss how to address a story, and you mentioned something about what happened when you publish it. We have kept in the frozen stories for several months in order to get better conditions of protection, either for sources and sometimes even for our own relatives and other people from our environment. So it's not worthwhile to risk your life for a news. Yes, definitely not. It is important to do that when we have certain conditions of minimum protection. Building allies is very, very important. National and international allies, having some kind of a resonance in terms of our coverage. I mentioned about collaborative journalism. Well, there's different levels of collaborative journalism. There was some time in which when we were censored, okay, we will share our scoop with some other media in order to have larger resonance and impact. And the international media also has been very important for this.
Hi, I'm the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of ARETS and on the advisory board of the Institute. I'm really interested in that moment you all described as like the tipping point between the spring, as you said, and the winter. And I was wondering if any of you has a thought about something that you should have done or you regret not doing or should have done differently maybe before that tipping point that, I don't know if could prevent it, you know, but something that maybe you regret or should have been done differently in your countries before that point where spring becomes autumn or winter?
It's not in the Nicaraguan case, nothing happens from one day to another. It was a long process. I'm describing a process of 15 years. And it's like a traffic light, you know, you have some indications about how far is the government going to go. We were attacked from very early from the Ortega government when he came back to power in 2007. In the year 2007, I think it was in May, August, when he launched a campaign. We broke a story about corruption within the government, and reporter asked Ortega whether he was going to investigate those evidences, and then he said, he twisted the story and he said, yes, we're going to investigate drug trafficking because there are people involved in drug trafficking, and those people, well, those people were my sources, and I was also supposedly be part of that. So for me, that was a clear case that things will get worse one day after the other.
We've got time for one more question because we're running out of time.
Yes.
Quick answer.
I would like to share some thoughts about that quickly. I think that we have learned don't be so naive, you know, because people believe that democracy or the rights, or, you know, something is forever. And when you can lose that, we are showing the situation. So, but also we have to be very careful about don't go to the other side. And, you know, we are not going to be naive, but we also have to give opportunity that what is happening. I'm going to bring an example. I don't want to discuss about that, but for example, what happened in Colombia with the President Petro. President Petro, some people from Venezuela say, okay, it's going to be like a Venezuela, but he was elected, but the majority, and you have they can govern, they can do what they have to do in democracy. So I think it's kind of be very in equilibrium, balance about the situation that you are living.
Can we have the last question from Bianca Jagger?
Thank you. My name is Bianca Jagger, and I am the founder and president of the Bianca Jagger Human Rights Foundation. Carlos Fernando, first, I would like to congratulate you and to thank you for your powerful and, as always, courageous statement. I wanted to ask you, because you were there, what could the international community do today? If you remember the role of the international community in 1979, just before Somoza fell, it played a very, very important role. And it is true that we're not fighting a war today in Nicaragua, but what can the international community do to help us finally get rid of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo?
I'll ask first the international press to keep Nicaragua in the radar of the news. There are many crises in different parts of the world, but our worst enemy is the normalization of dictatorship and impunity. And yes, Nicaragua recently came back to the news because of the release of political prisoners, but it will fade soon. Today is an important day because at this hour there is a discussion in Geneva in the Council of Human Rights where they are discussing this report by the 3 experts. And hopefully they will get an extension of their mandate and they will continue doing these investigations. And that will be important to at least to maintain the Nicaraguan human rights crisis as part of the discussion. There is you mentioned 1979. There is a big, big difference between the attitudes of certain countries in Latin America, particularly Mexico and others, arguing that because of their non-intervention principles, they cannot criticize a dictatorship like Daniel Ortega. But that's what López Obrador is saying. It's not this. On the contrary, Petro, you mentioned Petro from Colombia, or Boric from Chile, and many others are really saying, well, we should not have different standards to criticize violations of human rights, whether they come from the right, from the left, or from non-ideology or whatever. But I think we need more Latin American involvement in the Nicaraguan crisis. Central America, in particular, is completely absent in this debate. Then there are big questions about the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the Central American Integration Bank. And it's important, this report that is being discussed today, because one of the recommendations, they said, okay, countries should go through the channel of universal justice in order to take perpetrators to trial. And also is saying international organizations and government should condition their relationship with the Nicaraguan dictatorship to the observance of human rights and stop the violations of human rights. Hopefully that could be some kind of a new way for this strategy. Again, as I said before, well, this requires a medium-term or a long-term strategy accompanying the Nicaraguan crisis. It's not going to solve in 1 week or in 1 month or in 3 months. It really required incremental permanent pressure and trying to have an impact in the restoration of basic rights in Nicaragua. The solution is in Managua, not in Washington or in Brussels, but we require the restoration of political rights in Nicaragua.
The bad news is we have to stop there. The good news is there's a drink. If you go out through either of these doors, I think will work, and please join us for a drink at the end. But first of all, I want to thank Carlos for a really wonderful, inspiring warning and encouragement. And as I think Helen said, we're in awe of your bravery and resilience, and wish you all the best. And also for the other two panelists, Luz and John-Allan, for coming up tonight and sharing their experiences. It's been a really wonderful evening, but please, a big hand of applause.